Giant, aquatic, swamp, Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC. When I was 18, I didn't get along very well with my parents, and eventually one day, a friend of mine and I decided to run away to Spook Swamp in Pennsylvania and try to live off the land there. We had seen some movie about people living in the swamp, and to us living under the rule of stern parents, that looked like a perfect lifestyle. I'm pretty sure we would have chosen a different location if we had understood there was a giant dogman living there, larger than any bear I've ever seen. When we showed up at the swamp, after a day and a half of hiking, we only had about another day's worth of nuts and berries to subsist on, and we had a tent to sleep in. That's it. We had gone in with this notion of building ourselves a house on stilts in the water, like we had seen in some swamp movie on TV, but we had not brought plans or supplies with us. This was before cell phones and the internet, so it's not like we could sit there and Google the info. We really had no plan at all. We had no insect repellent either. We only had a vague vision. On what turned out to be our final day in the swamp, we were hiking when I saw the largest black bear in history in the swamp water in front of us. I grabbed my friend, who I'm going to call Kobe, and pulled him down with me behind a bush. From there, we both snuck peeks out at the creature. It had a very dark fur, but looked more like a dog than a bear. Its ears were pointed and somewhat taller than a bear's ears. While we watched, the creature was staring intently into the water as it stood there on all fours, with the water about up to its knees. Suddenly, it flew into loud action, and white water flew in every direction. When things settled down, that bear was no longer down on all fours. Now, it was standing up and holding some kind of a fish in its right hand. Yes, I said hand. You can't hold a living, squirming fish in a paw. You need a thumb to grip it strongly enough so that it will not escape. That's what this big guy was doing. So therefore, he possessed some kind of hands. So the thing that I could now clearly see was not a bear, was upright and walking bipedally to the opposite shore. There he bashed the fish into a rock, then began eating what he'd caught. I'm saying he now instead of it, because I did not see anything feminine about this animal. Both Kobe and I were certain that this was a male animal that was bear-sized, but not actually a bear. When he was done eating, the not-a-bear walked bipedally back out into the water, then splashed down on all fours, and recommenced staring intently into the water, looking for another meal he could spear with the long talons at the ends of his fingers. I turned to suggest to Kobe that we get out of there before the huge dog-like man-thing smelled us on the wind. But when I turned, Kobe wasn't there. I looked around frantically and eventually discovered him running toward the swamp water and toward the feral dog-headed man. To be clear, just because its fur was dark, that does not mean that I'm saying it was merely the size of a black bear. This one was taller, more like a polar bear, although probably not quite as tall as that. Definitely this guy would have towered over any of the black bear that I've seen. So it was my assumption that Kobe was running to get closer so that he could get a photograph of the beast. He and I are both hugely interested in cryptids now, but he already was then. I was not yet, and I just wanted to get us to safety. I didn't really recognize the importance of recording a sighting of an as-yet unproven animal, but I did recognize that we were seriously risking getting mauled, or worse, by whatever that dog-headed monster man was. I wanted to run away, but I didn't feel safe in the wilderness without Kobe, and I knew he wasn't safe without me. Especially if he was going to do dumb things like run towards monsters in a swamp. So I sort of tiptoed after him to hide where he had moved to. When I got there, he was fishing through his backpack for where he had stashed his old Kodak snapshot camera. I don't know if they make things like that anymore. It was a small little black plastic box that took pictures and had a built-in flash. At any rate, he couldn't find it, and he started whispering to me that I must have his camera. I knew for a fact that I did not, since I had only ever seen it one time. He never even took it out any other time. Either it was in his backpack, or he had mislaid it somewhere, but in neither case did it have anything to do with me. This notion didn't sit well with my friend, and soon we were in a whispering argument that got increasingly heated. One sign of the narcissism of many, including me and Kobe, is that we think that just because we're whispering, that means nobody can hear us. Similarly, Kobe and I thought that we were invisible because we were hiding behind that bush. Well, you aren't invisible if you're whispering loudly in an argument, as it turns out. It's also possible that we smelled enough for the creature to notice us that way as well. We were anything but invisible, and we came to understand that when we heard a kind of a shouting, somewhat related to barking, coming from the swamp. Both of us shut up, and both of us peeked out from behind that bush to get a glimpse of what that Dogman was doing. He was back down on all fours. He was running. He was running out of the water. He was running out of the water and toward me and Kobe. I remember feeling completely numb as we ran away. I couldn't feel the tips of my fingers, and after some time, I couldn't feel if I still had my backpack on either. I remember bouncing off trees hard and feeling no pain. I was never so scared before. It was so intense that it was an entirely new kind of experience to me. I saw no chance at all that we would both survive. I figured if we were lucky, only one of us would get taken by the giant dog, and that way the other one might survive as long as he abandoned his friend and kept running. So in other words, best case scenario was that I would only lose a good friend and not my own life. And that's all. There is a moment, or there was, just before I turned to run away from the Dogman swamp monster, in which I saw it from head to toe. It was just a second or two maximum, but I saw him make it to the shoreline and then stand up on his hind legs. I saw him from his dog feet to his dog legs to his massive humanoid chest, covered in slightly less fur than the rest of him. His front legs became arms when he stood upright, and when he held them back at his sides, he looked like a giant human wearing a dog head. In many descriptions of the Dogman, he is seen as svelte, muscular, but as thin as possible while being that muscular. Now this guy, while certainly not fat, was built out a bit. His waist was still the narrowest part of his physique, but it was wider than in your illustrations. Again, I don't mean to say the creature was fat, but it was wider, that's all. The Dogman's head looked like something that had died and been brought back to life. Maybe it was because it was soaking wet, coming out of the swamp. But this was not an attractive hound. It looked like a monster. It did not look like man's best friend, if you know what I mean. So we ran, and I was certain this would be my last time running. When you think it's the last time you're ever going to get to do something, it can take on an epic feel to you in that moment. I remembered every time I had run since I was very young. I remembered times I had fallen and skinned my knee, or tripped and fell headlong into the grass. I breathed in and out, and I pumped my legs, and I felt a kind of contentment as I mentally prepared myself for the end. But suddenly, we ran into and through a crowd of about 6 or 7 tourists, maybe 8. Possibly they were a family traveling together, I don't really know. Some of them had cameras around their necks, and Kobe shouted at one of them to take a picture of that. He pointed toward the Dogman, but then we both noticed the Dogman was no longer there. An uncomfortable silence ensued, as I realized these people now thought we were both insane. After looking back and forth silently, we just sort of walked away. So in the moment when we should have been feeling a sense of relief, and even triumph, that we had escaped the Dogman and lived through the incident, instead, we felt a sense of embarrassment. There was no way we could explain our behavior to those people unless the Dogman showed up and chased them too. It was just one of those times when you have to man up and take the L, I suppose. So, we didn't get to measure the creature, obviously, but we agreed that the thing was a minimum of 10 feet tall. And when it stood most upright, it might have even been over 11. Usually the taller cryptids reported are from up north, and the shorter ones down in places like Arkansas and Florida. Pennsylvania is in between, so I don't suppose it makes much sense to me that it's the apparent home of the giant, aquatic, swamp Dogman. The Rosenke, Texas werewolf infestation. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I ran into some old buddies from the early 70s, and together we're going to throw some crazy Dogman stories at you today. Of course, back then, when this stuff all first happened, we would call them wolfmen and werewolves. We hadn't heard the word Dogman yet. I went to college in Austin, but in my senior year I had a big argument with my parents, and I didn't have enough money to pay for my final semester there. I never did end up going back either. I wound up hooking up with some people I had met at school and moving to a place called Rosenke, Texas. It was just desert and prairie around there back then. But I had a paying job sweeping and cleaning at a church, and so I subsisted comfortably, and I did volunteer work for the police at night. I had more money than my poverty-stricken roommates, one of whom supposedly had inherited the house that we were all crashing in. I was thinking this all happened in 1970, but then when I was talking with the brothers, I remembered that I actually had other adventures in 1970, and I didn't end up in Rosenke until 1971. That was a year in which we had a problem in that we were overrun with werewolves. Dogmen, as they're called these days. But to us they were wolfmen and werewolves. That's not to say that any of us ever saw them transform back into men. I suppose they were just hairy animal men. There wasn't much to the town in those days, and I pretty much stuck to the church or our house, other than food shopping expeditions. Nevertheless, even though we spent as little time outdoors as we could manage, there were still werewolves there to mess with us, wherever we went. Even just walking home from the church, every single day you stood a chance of getting swarmed by these creepy critters who would just start reaching into your pockets and taking whatever they wanted from you. They were real jerks, these werewolves. They would take food out of your hand and start eating it in front of you. These were not huge creatures, but they were man-sized, and they were violent. They could run as fast and punch as hard as we could, and a lot of us got into scrapes all the time. They would just come up to you and punch you. They had no respect for the fact that this was a human settlement. There were more of the werewolves in that area in those days than there were us church-going folk, though, and they were aware that they had us outnumbered and cornered in our own town. After all, we were just a few people living in one little place, but the werewolves, they roamed the entire desert, from what I could make of it. We were a speck in the middle of their country. I'm having my grandson edit this email for me, and he had a lot of questions about how a dog could punch a man. These were not dogs. They were hairy werewolves. I mean, they weren't dogs or men. They were these in-between kind of fellows. I didn't care for them. They were unkind and selfish, in my opinion. I once saw one of them literally steal candy from a baby. Well, from a small kid. A teenager, actually, but a short one. And that werewolf stole his baby Ruth. It's been over 50 years now, but I remember it like it was yesterday. The summer of '71 in Rosenke, Texas was one for the books. That was the summer the man-sized furry werewolves took over our town. It started off innocently enough with rumors circulating about strange sightings in the desert at night. People whispered about shadows moving in the moonlight, about eerie howls echoing through the night. But nobody took it seriously until the first real reports started coming in. Reports of missing food, of strange footprints leading in and out of town, of livestock turning up dead, with strange bite marks on their necks. At first we nervously laughed it off as a prank, the work of some kids looking to stir up trouble. But as the summer wore on, and the sightings became more frequent, it also became clear that something weird was happening. I'll never forget the night I first saw one of them myself, before it became an everyday thing. I was out late, heading home from the church where I was working, when I heard a rustling in the bushes nearby. At first I thought it was just a raccoon, or maybe a stray dog, but then it stepped out into the moonlight, and I saw it for what it really was. A creature straight out of my worst nightmare. It stood at least as tall as I stood, covered head to toe in fur that was kind of a sandy brown color. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light as it stared at me. Not just your ordinary animal eyeshine either. I could see razor-sharp teeth behind its snarling lips. For a moment, we just stood there, locked in a silent standoff, before the creature turned and disappeared back into the darkness of the surrounding desert. That was the moment I knew they were real. After that night, things only got worse. The werewolves, as we came to call them, seemed to grow bolder with each passing day. They would raid our garbage cans, stealing food and leaving a trail of nasty garbage and messes in their wake. Besides scavenging food from us, they made a point of disrespecting us in our own towns, making themselves a nuisance in any way possible. They would pull pranks on unsuspecting residents that could have gotten people hurt, or worse. They once tipped over an outhouse while someone was inside, nearly drowning the man in fecal matter. They could go anywhere in the desert to howl, but they preferred howling at the moon outside bedroom windows at night. It became impossible to get a good night's sleep. But perhaps the most unsettling thing of all was their habit of lurking around the church on Sunday mornings. The sight of those monstrous creatures skulking in the shadows as we filed into the pews sent shivers down our spines, and more than one sermon was interrupted by howling. In the end, I'm not really sure what happened to the werewolves of Rosanki. I'm told they were driven off by the arrival of a new pastor who was armed with nothing but his faith. Others claimed that the werewolves simply grew tired of our town and moved on to terrorize somewhere else. But for those of us who lived through that summer of '71, the memories still linger. Memories of fear, uncertainty, of creatures lurking in the darkness, and of a time when the line between myth and reality seemed thinner than ever. You know, more recently, back during the pandemic, I was out shopping in one of those big globalist box retail stores because I had no choice. Inside, I ran into two brothers who also had no choice but to shop there. These were two guys who had also lived in Rosanki back when I did, and boy did we get to talking. At first we were talking the way doctors do it, through surgeon masks. But then we went outside where we were still allowed to behave like humans, and we renewed our friendship. Of course, one of the topics we all wanted to talk about were those werewolves. I remember I got a job offer back in my home state of Pennsylvania, so I moved out of Texas before it was even 1972, I think. The brothers told me they stayed on in the town until 79 or 80 before they moved back to Austin proper. Since we were having this conversation in western Pennsylvania, which is where we all live now, the brothers clearly didn't stay in Texas all that much longer than that. It was really great to talk to people about those wolfmen, and they had some anecdotes I had never heard before. I'm going to let them tell their story. They only want to be known as the brothers, so that's what we'll call them. Then after their stories, I'll come back and introduce one other of the old folk from my generation who still had some stuff to say about this before she left us. Right now, here's the brothers. Greetings, scary stories in New York City. We are the brothers in West PA. Back when we lived in Rosenke, Texas, we used to have to deal with an infestation of monkey-like wolf creatures. In the 90s or 2000s, we saw a documentary about monkeys in India running around and bothering everyone, making a real nuisance of themselves. We looked at each other when we saw that, and we were both thinking the same thing. It was just like those old werewolves back in Rosenke. There weren't usually as many of them at once as with the monkeys, but when the pests are over 5 feet tall, sometimes over 6, you don't need as many to have a problem. My grandson tells me that the internet says that Dogman are 11 feet tall and can run faster than a freight train. I guess the ones we saw were the weak grandfathers of those Dogmen then. They were skinny, but wiry and athletic. Most of them were a little shorter than us grown men, but they were as fast or faster than we were. And they were sometimes stronger than we were too. Plus, they were dogs, so basically nothing was off limits to them, in their opinion. You know what dogs are like, they smell each other's butts and eat their own poo. Sorry, dog lovers, but you know what I'm saying. They can be uncouth creatures. And if they start to think that they're the alphas, then you better get ready to get pushed around by them unmercifully. And unendingly. I hear some of you saying dogs are nice. Dogs are loyal. Sure, if you're bigger than them, if you outnumber them, and if you give them a lot of food. If they're bigger than you and they outnumber you, they take what they want from you. And then they are not nice, and they are not loyal. And that was the situation we found ourselves in. There were more dog people than human people, and they didn't need to be very organized to win every single exchange they had with any of us. Early on in the summer, we would still have barbecues and cookouts behind the house, but we soon learned that wasn't going to fly any longer. We were hanging in our backyard one evening and making burgers when 3 or 4 of the wolfmen all showed up at once. Now, these dogs didn't beg for scraps. They just went up and took them away. Usually they'd bother the women first because they were smaller. I never saw any of them behave any differently from any of the others, and it almost felt like they were just kinda mindless. Hungry, mindless, violent, furry monster men, with no respect for anyone around them. We should have deported them to New York City, where they could get free tax money and get to live in hotels. But back there in Rosenke, we understood the meaning of having limited resources, and we could not afford to feed both ourselves and these dog-headed wolfman pests, who came in from the desert and knocked our garbage cans over while we were trying to sleep. There was a time after the guy who got us to write this moved back here to PA, when the werewolves even broke into our house. We had actually been going through food faster than usual, and we'd been arguing with each other about who was eating all the food. Then one night, when all the housemates were in eating a dinner together, ba-bam! Both the front and back doors got kicked in, and 3 or 4 man-sized werewolves came running in from both ends. We hadn't even noticed them gathering outside. They must have snuck up on us to ambush us. That took some strategic thinking, and some organization, too. Of course, once they were inside, they just ran willy-nilly the way dogs do. Their eyes were wide open, and their tongues were hanging out the sides of their mouth, as they invaded the home, pushed all of us out of the way, grabbed our dinner off the table, and ran out the opposite way they'd come in. So like the ones from the back ran in, grabbed food, and kept running out the front, while the ones who had kicked in the front door did the same thing in reverse. They were gone before any of us were even standing up again. And so was our dinner. So then after that, we had this guy who worked at the church come and fix our doors, trying to reinforce them to make them harder to break into a second time. While he was there, he showed us that our basement door, which we never used, was actually broken. He showed us that the Dogman had been able to get into and out of our house for some time before that home invasion night. It had to have been them, quietly letting themselves into our basement and robbing us of food a little bit at a time over a long period of time. This also demonstrates a certain amount of brain function, don't you think? It's sneaky and it's uncool, but it's also kind of intelligent. We never even figured out that they were doing that. Whereas if they had broken in and stolen a lot at once, we'd have probably searched around for how they had gotten in. It's also really smart because if they had brought the food out to the woods, it would have started to rot as soon as it thawed. By only taking what they needed a little at a time, they were having us keep their meat fresh for them. It was pretty ingenious, really. They were smarter than we were. We eventually had all our doors and windows covered over with wooden coverings both inside and out. It looked like we were in the middle of a war, and I guess in a sense we sort of were. The story of how the werewolves went away is a bit anticlimactic. We got a new pastor at the church, see? He led us all in prayer to God, asking that the werewolves find themselves a better home, somewhere far from us, and far from people in general. This pastor, let's call him St. Patrick for fun, he had this way of leading us in prayer together as one congregation, and of then convincing us that all we had to do now was wait for God to get around to what we had prayed for. He would then talk about how great it was going to feel when those werewolves were gone. Imagine being able to sleep the night through with no howling waking you up. How would that feel? He asked us to feel that feeling you get after a good night of sleep. He asked us to feel what it was going to feel like not to have your food stolen any longer. We would all leave his prayer sessions feeling happy, but I know I didn't expect them to work in the real world. After a while, though, we started to notice that we hadn't seen them for a while. Maybe it was random. Maybe the town was too boarded up for the werewolves to break in any longer. Or maybe our prayers worked, I don't know. It did feel just like we thought it would feel, to have the town back for ourselves. It felt good. Well, that's all we brothers have to say, so we're going to hand it back to your narrator now. Thank you to the brothers. Now, we had reunited with one of our other housemates from back in the olden days, who we can call Mary. And we got her to write down one of her werewolf stories for us one time a while back. It was a good thing we did, too, because Mary passed away this November, unfortunately. I'd like to finish up with her anecdote. I also have another story of a personal battle between me and a dogman or werewolf, but mine is a lot more violent, so I've separated it from the others as you've asked me to do. That's fine if you want to make that story for your channel members only. And now, in conclusion, here is the story from Mary. When people talk about the werewolves we lived with in the early 70s, they mainly talk about them as pests and scavengers. While that is true, they were also canines, and so I found them to have a nicer side. Well, at least one of them. There was one I nicknamed Rusty, who had been the first one I'd seen come to our town. He looked like a big old Irish setter kind of dog, and reminded me of an Irish setter that lived with my family when I was younger. The thing is, when I tossed some food to Rusty one day, he picked it up with his front paws to look at it more closely. And then Rusty reared back on his hind legs, holding the Twinkie I had thrown him and smelling it all over. It was like he wasn't sure if it was food or what he was supposed to do with it. Eventually he shoved it in his mouth and bit down, resulting in cream filling getting all over the outside of his mouth. I would have laughed, except that he stood taller than I did when he was reared up like that, and I found it a bit intimidating. His paws looked a little too much like hands. But I still wasn't adding this all up in my head. I wasn't getting that he was a werewolf or a wolfman or whatever you want to call him. I was just thinking that he was a very talented Irish setter. Now, one day, Rusty came by for his snack, and when I tossed him a hot dog, he got swarmed by other larger dogmen or wolfmen, who stole the hot dog from him, and then chased me back into my house. That was the end of me giving food to any of those creatures. From then on, I was afraid of them, and with good reason. But because of the brief period in which I was able to have some fun with the one I nicknamed Rusty, I know they aren't just evil killing machines. They're just 99% evil killing machines. And then you find the 1 in 100 that's like Rusty, and you remember to look for the good in everyone. whenever you can.
Now he's a sticker, sticking to my book, sticking to my wall, everywhere I look, sticking where you like, with some exceptions, nothing to get, it's in the description. I'm gonna call him Scary Sticker Man, yo.
We got 2 donations today from Tiffany. In terms of donations, it was quite a polyphony. Please join us in thanking Tiffany Walsh for making this episode possible. I fought a real life Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I can't believe how popular Dogman has gotten lately, and how many different stories people have to tell. I had a Dogman encounter back in the early to mid-1970s, and when I used to try to tell people about it, nobody even wanted to hear. It wasn't a Bigfoot, so people back then told me I was just making it up. I'm going to try telling my Dogman story to my grandkids this Christmas, and see if any of them are cryptid fans. I thought I'd write it all down for you first, so I can get my memories straight in my head. I guess this was 1973 or 74. And Kung Fu was a big craze here in America. Karate, judo, martial arts in general, they were all popular. I enrolled to study Kung Fu, though, at a neighborhood dojo in the suburbs of Detroit that was taught by the toughest guy I'd ever met in my life. I had been a big fan of going camping with my dad as I was growing up, and after taking some Kung Fu classes, I started going out camping alone and practicing my Kung Fu in my bare feet, out on the hard ground all day and all night. I got more and more confident in my abilities, and I started to become cocky and careless. I was so certain I could take down any man that I forgot I was out in nature. I left too much food out for too long, and a very large predator was attracted to walk right into my camp. I had been driving over to Addison Oaks County Park to be alone and work on my martial arts for some time before this happened. I just found it mellow up there, and sometimes I would pretend it was a long time ago in the East, and that I was a character in some Kung Fu movie that I had seen recently. There's a lake, and you can rent space to set up a tent away from most of the others, who are families that arrive in their trailers and campers. Sometimes their noises would come wafting over, and I found that reassuring, in case I ever had an emergency. But when the emergency finally arrived, I was hoping none of those families heard what was happening. I wanted them to stay away, because this creature and I were not pulling any punches. The creature's opening gambit was not to attack, but to surprise, to sneak, and to attempt to grab a big bag of beef jerky away from its spot, about 18 inches away from my campfire. I have never seen a wild animal walk into camp, angling for my food, or getting halfway that close to the campfire. So this guy must have been pretty hungry. Looking back on it so many years later, I kind of wonder why I didn't just let him have the beef jerky. I still had my own version of trail mix, and since that had no meat in it, I doubt he'd have been interested in any of that. I guess it was just that I was a hot-headed young guy, worked up from practicing my moves over and over. So I kind of flipped out a bit on the Dogman, kicking the beef jerky out of his hands, and landing perfectly in position to fight him further, if he didn't back off. That creature looked so surprised that I remember laughing at him. I laughed in the face of the North American upright walking canine, and I lived to tell the tale. He sort of took a step back, slowed the pace of the situation down, looked me over from head to foot. We locked eyes. His teeth were bigger than my head. I could see that even peripherally. He was growling before I even noticed it, and that made me shiver. I was genuinely afraid of him, and I hadn't been afraid of anything for some long time. In fact, the very information that I was afraid frightened me more than the Dogman itself. I had felt as though I could handle any battle when I kicked that jerky away. Already, I was wishing I knew where it landed, so I could go fetch it, and maybe avoid this fight that was about to happen. So I was still a beginner student, a yellow belt. Well, not a beginner exactly, that would be white belt, but I was not very far along in my studies. I had intended to use the little I learned in the fight, but the only martial arts concept that I had truly comprehended back then was the idea of being like the wind or like the water, and I think I learned that from some public service announcement or something, or maybe an interview with Bruce Lee, I don't remember. So, when the Dogman lunged at me, I either leaned back, or when I had the chance, I would sort of dance backward a little bit. I was no longer battling someone in my class. I was battling something that didn't even officially exist. I felt like I was about to panic, and so I unleashed a barrage of blows toward the creature's face, all of which it easily avoided. Maybe it had seen that same film clip that I had seen. One thing I had a natural talent for was doing kicks, especially the most fun kick, which in my opinion was the roundhouse kick. I decided it would only work once against a fighter as athletic and big as the Dogman was, so I did my best spin, and kapow! I landed a solid hit right across the side of this beast's long, dog-like snout, which, I would like to point out, was literally over my head, even though he was leaning down. I think I was the same height then as I am now, which is 5'10". My kick was very high, and maybe hit him at around 6 feet off the ground, I guess. If he leaned down into that, maybe he was 7 feet. Maybe he was even taller. At any rate, it smacked his face to the side, and it stunned him. I could see the surprise on his huge and very expressive canine face. Again, the bipedal upright beast took a few steps back, and again, he reappraised me and the situation. This time he bared his teeth. He growled, and he walked toward me, but not at me. I was surprised and danced away a bit, giving him more room. Rather than attacking me, the immense Dogman walked directly past me, past some trees, and into some bushes. I thought he was going away, but then suddenly, he reversed course and came back out of the woods, holding something. It was my bag of jerky that I'd kicked out of his hand earlier. He offered it to me. He held it in one of the claws that served as its hands, and held that arm or front leg out, fully extended, in my direction. He seemed to be handing my jerky back to me. Again, I should have just let him have it, but I was young, and I was greedy. I took what I thought was a cautious step forward to snatch at my bag of dried-out smoked cow, and that Dogman easily just leaned forward and smacked me on the side of my head so hard that I bounced off a tree and then back into his paw for him to whack me back into the tree. Now, I hadn't had my behind handed to me for some time before that, but the Dogman schooled me. I tried to get up to fight some more, but I could not regain my balance. I think I might have had a mild concussion. So I fell back down onto the dirt, and this seemed to calm the big dog-headed man thing down. He reached into the bag, pulled out a large hunk of jerky, and chomped down, biting half of it off with one snap of his bear-trap jaws. Taking the part that remained of the jerky, he tossed it on the ground in my direction, then turned and walked back the way he came, all the rest of my jerky in his hand, as his prize for having won our little private tournament. I had been humiliated, yes, but I had not been unfairly treated. The Dogman could have torn me limb from limb. There's a lot more meat on a human than in a bag of beef jerky, believe me. He let me go, which sort of said that I didn't even rise to the level of being meat. Like I was some kind of soy product, or near meat. And you know what? I knew he was right. I couldn't deny any part of that. To me, The Dogman was the greatest sensei that I ever encountered. As I progressed through rankings, for a brief while becoming one of the better fighters in my region, I always wished for a second chance to face off against the Dogman. I wondered if I could win if we had a rematch. Every bit of training, every bit of practice I did, was geared toward preparing me for a rematch that sadly never happened. I camped in that same spot so many nights, for so many years, but the Dogman never judged me worthy of a second chance. In my advancing years, I've met and fought some pretty good Midwestern fighters. I once partied with a guy who fought Jackie Chan in a movie, and I wanted to hear every detail. When he was done, he asked me to tell him about the greatest opponent I ever battled, and I felt embarrassed. I had to answer in a shy way that the greatest fighter I ever encountered was not a human being, but some kind of a dog-headed man, like a werewolf. This man's eyes grew wide, but not because he thought I was crazy. He started trying to say Lugaroo, but his native accent made it sound quite different. It turned out he had heard of the American werewolf that's known to live down in Louisiana. I told him that the one I fought was the northern cousin of the Lugaroo, and he made his friends shut up so that he could hear my story. I lost the fight badly, as I told you, and I was honest with him about it. But he didn't see it that way. This professional fighter thought that the main part of the story was that I survived to tell it. This wasn't like a paid wrestling match or a staged fight in a movie. This was a hot-headed young guy just learning how to fight, managing to hold off a creature of myth and legend. By all logic, this professional fighter told me I should have been torn to pieces by the Dogman. I should not have lived to fight another day. Well, when he put it that way, I felt a little less embarrassed. Not a lot, but a little. He bought me a few more drinks, and then I wasn't feeling anything at all. Which reminds me, the tips of my fingers are numb, because I haven't typed this much since the 20th century. I think I'll be bringing this bird in for a landing now. I'm hoping I live another 50 years, but in case I don't, I've reserved a nice plot of land under a shady tree to be buried in. And I've already paid for a tombstone, which I would like to read. I fought a real-life Dogman.
If you want a coloring book full of monstrous delight, then give this a look. It'll give you a fright, right? Scary stories, coloring book, werewolf coloring book. And just to make your mind explode, it's a digital download. All it costs is $2.09, and then you will be feeling fine. Coloring monsters today, hey, it's a coloring book, hooray. Okay, link is in the description.
Dogman thinks he owns my lake, or our entire village are werewolves. Dear Scary Stories NYC, for our entire lives, my wife and I have sought upward mobility. Now that our youngest is in college, we finally were able to afford to move into a neighborhood of older school rich people. Although we adore our new neighbors, there are a lot of eccentricities and strange hardships we never had to deal with when we lived among the working class. For instance, when we lived in an apartment building, we never wondered if all our neighbors were werewolves. I'm not using a word like werewolf randomly either. On one of our first nights in the house, I woke up at dawn to find my wife, we could call Martha, staring out one of the windows in the back of the house that overlooks the lake we share ownership of with some of our neighbors. The sunsets and sunrises around that lake can be spectacular, so I moved in close behind my wife and squinted out the window to see what she was looking at. I was greeted first by a multicolored sky that caused me to issue an involuntary little ah sound. And then my eyes fell upon the main item of interest to my wife, the thing which had caused her to stare. There was a man out there, facing away from us and observing the lake like he owned it, and his presence caused me to involuntarily gasp. He appeared to be nude, but he also appeared to have a coat of short fur or hair covering his entire body. I've seen photos from ages past of sideshow freaks covered entirely in hair from head to foot, and I always wondered if those pictures were real. Maybe that's what my wife was wondering about this guy. I tried to lean closer to the window without disturbing Martha. To steady my balance, I reached out my hand and grabbed the edge of the window, making a soft, bumping sound. When I did so, that figure turned his head quickly toward us, and my wife and I ducked down under the window, as though that hairy individual out there were the owner, and we were the trespassers. And as I hugged my shivering wife while we hid under that window, I had the image of that hairy man's face burned onto my retina still. It was the head of a dog. A dark gray wolf-like dog head with large leathery nostrils and oversized meat-eating chompers. I saw it as it turned toward me, and I watched it as I sunk down to hide like a coward. It sure didn't seem like a mask, but I had only seen it at dawn through a window. Maybe it was a man wearing a mask, I tried to tell myself. As we huddled down there, I listened, because I hadn't heard the creature man leave. Was it still there? Was it creeping closer to the house? If I looked up, would I see it staring back down at me? Was it gone? Or was it still frozen in place, in the exact same location? A shiver ran through me just thinking about it, which caused Martha to shiver again herself. Our daughter had quietly entered the scene and was silently staring at us, trying to figure out what we were doing huddled under the window like that. Finally, she flipped on the light and asked us what was up, and we nearly both had a heart attack. I banged my head on the bottom of the windowsill as I stood up, and it was generally a bad way to start the day for me personally. Even as I was typing that last paragraph into my email, my wife and daughter burst into the room, carrying their large cat, and emotionally made me swear not to let their cat outside anymore. It was easy to agree to, since I never let their cat out or in or anything in my entire life. It runs when I approach and won't let me pet it, which is all fine with me. The cat and I consider ourselves separate but equal, if you know what I mean. Nevertheless, I listened as the two of them told me their latest horror story. Just a few minutes ago, according to them, they had been watching the cat outside in the back, walking through the snow. Suddenly, this dog-headed werewolf, which my wife insisted was the same one that she and I had seen staring out over the lake, leaped over the back fence and raced the poor kitty to the back door. The two ladies informed me that I was to remove or board up the cat door in the kitchen, and that Kitty was strictly a house cat from now on, for the sake of her own safety. I was like, fine, whatever as far as the cat went, but I wanted to hear more about this predator supposedly coming on our property, trying to eat our pets. I had only seen it from the back and standing still. I couldn't really fully picture it racing after a cat. Did it run on all fours? Did it run like a man? It turned out that it did a bit of both, sometimes leaping objects while upright, and other times using his hands to balance himself while leaping and thrusting himself forward. My daughter said it runs like a man, and then it runs like a dog, and then it runs like a monkey. It uses what it needs to use to propel itself forward. It can run on dirt as easily as it can swing from a nearby tree. Even having that described to me caused my blood to run cold. I think this description really causes me to be afraid of the creature. I asked them if it was still by the back door, and they didn't seem to know. The idea of it lurking around the home we live in gives me the absolute creeps. For all I know, the thing is still outside even as I type this. Our successful grown son with his own family was following our problems on the phone, but that didn't stop him from having strongly held opinions. He felt, and still feels, that the werewolf must be a relative of one of our neighbors. He insists that if we were to ask around, we discovered that they already would know exactly who or what I was talking about. He reminded me of the story I had told him, the real estate person who sold us the place. She told us that the neighborhood was like a soap opera. When we asked her which one, she laughed and thought about it and then responded, "Dark Shadows." We hadn't heard of that one, but later on when I looked it up, I'm sorry to say it was a pretty good description of the people we live among now. Our daughter says all the kids in her college think that our town is run by a coven of werewolves. I told her there is no such thing as a coven of werewolves. It's witches that come in covens. I've explained this to her over and over. Each time I'm done, she just looks at me blankly and insists all over again that our town is run by a coven of werewolves. I have one more story that our mailman told me when I was asking him about weirdnesses I should look out for around here. He told me that one dark morning, he saw a dog stare at him while he was delivering the mail in a really intense fashion. The dog was making him scared to do his job. He didn't know if the thing was going to jump up and run after him. Well, once our mailman put the mail in that mailbox on that dark morning, he claimed that the dog who had been watching him stood up on his hind legs and walked away like a man. So my family are not the only ones seeing things like this around here. I don't doubt that this is real. I just need to know if this is an actual danger for us. Obviously we'll keep the cat inside, but is this a danger for us humans? If we're going to get along with people from higher income brackets, we're going to have to be flexible and accept that they may have different cultural practices from regular normal people. I just need to know if my wife and daughter are going to be safe living here, because I think our entire village are werewolves.
If you want a coloring book full of monstrous delight, then give this a look. It'll give you a fright, right? Scary stories, coloring book, werewolf coloring book. And just to make your mind explode, it's a digital download. All it costs is $2.09, and then you will be feeling fine. Coloring monsters today, hey, it's a coloring book, hooray. Okay, link is in the description.
The Kangaroo Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC. Do you ever get Dogman stories from Missouri? I've got a really weird one for you. So we got this place that I love to go to in the summer, called Lake of the Ozarks. The thing about this lake is that it's sort of shaped more like a river. I mean, it's this snake that winds around and around and around for miles and miles. And yet I guess it must be a lake, otherwise they wouldn't call it that. At any rate, I like to kayak on that river, on that lake, and I like to camp out there with whoever I'm friends with during that point in my life. These days it's me and the wife, but we used to bring the kids before they dyed their hair green and changed their gender identities. Now they don't like to camp, and really I'm fine with that. This story happened during a time when I used to go camping with my friend Manny. He was a good guy to hang with, because he liked to listen, and he didn't have too much to say. So, I was talking up a storm, and he was listening up a storm, and it was around sundown, We were walking by the cliffs on the southern side of the river, lake, in that part of it. Right over at the very edge, though, looking straight down at the rocks and water far below, was this very large figure. Initially, I was concerned that someone was about to jump over the edge and end their life, when I noticed this out of the corner of my eye. I tapped Manny and we both looked over at this character, who then stood up at attention, facing away from us, and out toward the water. It was almost as though he had eyes in the back of his head, and he could see that we were looking at him. Well, we were looking, but we weren't sure what we were seeing. It looked like a dog, but it couldn't be a dog, because it was standing up like a man, or at least like a bear. It had good posture, better than any ape I've ever seen images or video of. They slouch. This canine did not. Suddenly it spun around and was facing us, and the creature didn't seem to like what it was seeing. I bet we looked pretty scared in that precise second. But there was no fear at all in the glowing reddish-orangish eyes of the beast we were now looking at. He had to be 8 or 9 or 10 feet tall. This was something sized in prehistoric terms, not in modern man-sized terms. It looked as though it could drop to all fours and run naturally as a dog does, and yet it also looked thoroughly natural standing up on its hind legs, the way that it was. My initial impression was that this beast was skinny looking. If it really was 9 or 10 feet tall, as I'm guessing, then it must have in fact been remarkably wide. I can attest that it was 2 or 3 times as wide as me, but I haven't reached that part of this incident yet. I'm trying to say that if you're as tall as this guy was, you can be wider than any man who ever lived, and yet still give the appearance of being very skinny. In fact, this creature seemed more muscular, athletic, and strong than any living thing, short of an elephant. Now, before I tell you the next and most amazing part, I want to emphasize that we got a pretty good look at this creature's face, and it was canine. It was not a rodent, like a giant rabbit. It was not a marsupial from Australia or New Zealand. This was a dog, but it stood up. Its eyes were like dog eyes. Its ears were upright triangular dog or wolf ears. Its teeth were not the kind made to eat lettuce. It had the teeth of an animal that was either a carnivore or an omnivore, but most definitely not a herbivore. This was a Dogman. It was an upright walking canine, with paws that seemed partially adapted into claws, which were somewhat hand-like. I doubt he could have played flamenco guitar, but I bet he could have picked up a stone or a stick and hit me with it. And which is the more valuable skill if you're living in nature off the land? So now that I've doubled and tripled down on insisting that we are in fact talking about a canine here, I'm about to tell you something that is going to make you argue with me and tell me that I'm wrong. So first we saw that upright beast looking out over the water from the very edge of the cliff. Then it turned and growled and glared at us. So what all this was leading up to was this. That Dogman leaped in the air in our direction, probably moving itself 30 feet closer to us in one impossible leap. Manny and I gasped, unsure what we should do. The Dogman leaped again, jumping off both its feet at once, not unlike the manner in which a kangaroo jumps, but leaping far higher into the air and much farther forward than even the strongest kangaroo could ever hope to do. Then that monster looked right at me, bared its teeth, and leaped again, right in my direction. Manny and I screamed like 2 small children. The beast man's second kangaroo-like hop took him soaring over our heads by a good 6 to 8 inches, then another 10 feet past us further inland. Without even looking behind him, he just kept on going until he was out of our sight. Go ahead, roll your eyes. tell me that what we saw was a kangaroo, and that I'm only exaggerating the creature's leaping ability. You won't be the first to say that to me, and you probably won't be the last either. But kangaroos have much taller ears than this creature had. They don't have wolf-like ears. I know some of them can get very big and strong, but this was not a kangaroo. This was a dog that hopped. Manny's mother says she used to know a dog that hurt its front legs and learned to walk upright on its hind legs. When it wanted to go faster, though, it would not run, it would hop, the way we saw this creature doing. It couldn't jump over your head, though, so that seems to be only a partial explanation. Maybe what we saw really was a Dogman, but maybe it had one or more injuries on one or both of its arms, preventing it from running when down on all fours. Might a Dogman not also develop the same backup methods of movement that a normal dog would? So maybe what we saw was an injured Dogman, or one that had at least once been injured on its front legs, aka its arms. It's at least one somewhat feasible explanation for our encounter with the kangaroo Dogman. So, who is Ms. All Business? Our new EP, she isness. Please join me in thanking Ms. All Business for becoming our newest PayPal Club member. She gets to see the 2 all-new secret uncensored stories that we just put out this week. Namely, Dogman gnawed my scalp, and I wear a werewolf skin to hide my ugliness. Both videos are available only to our club members. We have 2 clubs, and to explain how you can choose which to join, may I present our international TV spokesmongrel, Henry Lee Dogman. Hank. Thanks, Biggie, and thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos, or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com, or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that when it cuts off after I think 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.